new dimension. Action that exceeds all expectations. X. Experience the extreme. Only at Six Flags Magic Mountain.
X is one of the most daring prototype roller coasters ever built. Constructed on a colossal scale, its massive 20-foot wide trains send riders through controlled front and back flips. This first of its kind seat rotation system allowed X to combine experiences that had never coexisted on a single coaster. Riding above the rails, riding below the rails, traveling forward and traveling backward all in one ride. That unprecedented design quickly earned X a reputation as not only the most unique roller coaster in the world, but also the most extreme, perfectly aligning with its name and catchphrase, X, experience the extreme. Even nearly 25 years after opening, X, now known as X2, still outthrills many of the newest roller coasters being built today. What makes X even more impressive is the extraordinary effort required to bring it to life. The rotating seats, cantilever trains, and sheer scale of the ride introduced a daunting list of engineering challenges, demanding an absurd number of design and construction hours to overcome. Unfortunately, the difficulty of delivering such an ambitious project ultimately pushed its manufacturer, Aerodynamics, into bankruptcy. The company severely underestimated the cost of producing X, resulting in losses totaling millions of dollars. Even after construction was complete, new problems emerged. The trains dramatically exceeded their intended design weight, among many other unforeseen issues. As a result, X quickly became a maintenance nightmare, and the battle to create the ride evolved into an ongoing struggle to make the fully built coaster function as intended. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the history of X, the issues that plagued the original ride, the changes made to eliminate those problems, and the quirks that X2 can still experience today. This video is in no way meant to cast negative light on Aerodynamics or Six Flags Magic Mountain. And if you enjoyed the video, consider hitting the like button, as that helps the channel immensely against the YouTube algorithm. Without further ado, let's spin into the history of X. I find the story of how X came to be absolutely fascinating because it wasn't the result of a single bold decision, it was the coalition of two powerful factors. First, the slow decline of a legendary ride manufacturer, Aerodynamics, and second, a wildly aggressive Six Flags corporate strategy, one that embraced risky prototype attractions while racking up staggering levels of debt. To understand why X became so massive and why it ultimately landed at Six Flags Magic Mountain, we need to start with the park itself. By 2001, Magic Mountain had firmly established itself as one of the most dominant amusement parks in the United States. Located just 35 minutes north of downtown Los Angeles, the park welcomed an estimated 3.3 million visitors in the year 2000, numbers strong enough to justify another major headline attraction. Just as importantly, Magic Mountain had built its identity on record-breaking thrill rides, making it the perfect home for something as radical as X. That reputation began decades earlier. When the park first opened in 1971, it wasted little time chasing records. In 1976, Magic Mountain debuted the Great American Revolution, a steel roller coaster built by the German manufacturer Schwarzkopf. It became the first modern roller coaster to feature a vertical loop. Just 2 years later, the park raised the bar again with Colossus. Built by International Amusement Devices, this dual-tracked racing wooden coaster opened as the tallest and fastest roller coaster in the world, standing 125 feet tall and reaching speeds of 62 miles per hour. In 1979, Six Flags officially acquired Magic Mountain, folding it into what was then a much smaller chain of Six Flags parks than we know today. Throughout the 1980s, the park continued to grow, adding new attractions like Ninja, built by Aerodynamics in 1988. While Ninja was not a record breaker, it marked the continued working relationship between Magic Mountain and Aero. Then, everything changed in 1989. This was the year Aerodynamics unleashed Magnum XL 200 at Cedar Point, the world's first roller coaster to break the 200-foot barrier. Towering at 205 feet, Magnum was absolutely massive for its time, and its debut ignited what would become known as the Coaster Wars, an era where parks raced to outdo one another with even larger and faster roller coasters. Magic Mountain entered the Coaster Wars in 1990 with Viper. Also built by Aerodynamics, Viper stood 188 feet tall, making it shorter than Magnum, but it compensated with 7 intense inversions, earning the title of the world's tallest and fastest looping roller coaster. At this point, Aerodynamics still stood at the forefront of coaster innovation. In 1991, Aero escalated the arms race even further with Steel Phantom at Kennywood. It featured a massive 225-foot second drop plunging into a ravine, easily making it the world's largest drop. The ride also opened as the world's fastest roller coaster, hitting speeds of 80 miles per hour. By the mid-1990s, Aero continued to push height records. In 1994 alone, the company delivered 2 more coasters exceeding 200 feet. Pepsi Mac's Big One at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, standing 213 feet tall, and Desperado at the Buffalo Bills Hotel and Casino, reaching 209 feet tall. Like Steel Phantom, Desperado utilized terrain to achieve a 225-foot drop and speeds of 80 miles per hour. But this moment marked the end of Aero's dominance. In 1996, the next tallest and fastest roller coaster, Fujiyama at Fuji-Q Highland, was not built by Aero, but the Japanese manufacturer Togo. Standing 259 feet tall, Fujiyama signaled a shift in the industry, as Aero began to fall behind its competitors. The coaster wars surged on, and Magic Mountain had no intention of backing down. In 1997, the park reclaimed the spotlight with Superman the Escape. Built by the Swiss manufacturer Intamin, it became the first roller coaster to reach 100 miles per hour and tower over 400 feet, with a staggering height of 415 feet. While controversial due to its shuttle design, as its cars never reached the peak of its vertical spike, and some coaster fans did not even consider the ride a true roller coaster, Superman undeniably shattered previous limits of scale and technology, and proved Magic Mountain was willing to take unprecedented risks. The park doubled down in 1998 with Riddler's Revenge, built by the Swiss manufacturer Bolliger & Mabillard, or B&M for short. To this day, it remains the tallest and fastest stand-up roller coaster ever constructed. Then came Goliath in 2000. Built by the Swiss manufacturer Giovanola, it briefly claimed the title of the world's tallest and fastest complete circuit roller coaster, featuring a 255-foot first drop and a top speed of 85 miles per hour. But the coaster wars were moving faster than ever. Just months later, Cedar Point in Ohio debuted Millennium Force, the first complete circuit roller coaster to exceed 300 feet tall. And before even that record could settle, Steel Dragon 2000 opened at Nagashima Spaland, rising 318 feet into the sky and stretching an astonishing 8,133 feet in length, making it not only the tallest and fastest complete circuit roller coaster, but also the world's longest. This was the start of the environment that created X, an era defined by setting records regardless of the cost, and a park obsessed with claiming records. This leads us to the decline of Aerodynamics. After the debut of Desperado and Pepsi Mac's Big One, every new record-breaking roller coaster was built by a different manufacturer. Aerodynamics, once the undisputed leader of the industry, had fallen behind. This is astonishing when you consider Aero's legacy. Aero did not just influence the modern amusement industry, they helped create it. Under their original name, Aero Development, the company built many of Disneyland's original opening day attractions, including Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, Casey Jr. Circus Train, and the Mad Tea Party, as well as future classics like Haunted Mansion and Pirates of the Caribbean. In 1959, Aero forever changed roller coaster design with the opening of Matterhorn bobsleds at Disneyland. It was the world's first tubular steel roller coaster, and it revolutionized how coasters could be built. As Disneyland's success sparked the construction of large amusement parks across the United States, Aero found itself in high demand. In 1963, the company built El Asadero at Six Flags Over Texas, the world's first modern flume ride. It was so popular that the park added a second flume just 5 years later. In 1966, Aero debuted its first mine train coaster, Runaway Mine Train, also at Six Flags Over Texas. Soon, Aero mine trains and flume rides were appearing in parks all over the country. When Magic Mountain opened in 1971, Aero was there from day one, delivering Gold Rusher, an Aero mine train coaster, and Logjammer, the first of the park's 2 Aero flume rides. In 1975, Aero once again pushed coaster technology forward with Corkscrew at Knott's Berry Farm, the world's first modern looping roller coaster. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Aero continued building taller, faster, and more intense looping coasters, at a time when advanced manufacturing techniques were not readily available. Thus, Aero's track was still largely bent by hand, and even so, Aero managed to define an entire era of thrill rides. However, the industry was starting to change. By the mid-1980s, computer-aided design and drafting, and more precise manufacturing techniques were becoming more widely available. These technologies unlocked smoother transitions, tighter tolerances, and entirely new ride possibilities. Other manufacturers began to embrace the shift, but Aero did not. A clear turning point came in 1986 with the opening of Shockwave at Magic Mountain. 2 of the engineers behind that ride would go on to form B&M the following year. By fully embracing computer-aided design and drafting and more modern manufacturing methods, B&M quickly became the industry standard throughout the 1990s. Meanwhile, Aero continued building coasters largely the same way they always had. To avoid making this video even longer than it already is, I won't go too deep into Aero's old school design philosophy. If you want a deeper breakdown, I cover this extensively in my videos on Loch Ness Monster and Drachenfire at Busch Gardens Williamsburg. But in short, by the early 1990s, B&M was delivering smooth, state-of-the-art coasters designed with CAD, and manufactured using computer numerical control or CNC machining, while Aero's massive steel coasters were still being designed and fabricated using decades-old methods. By the mid-1980s, Aero should have modernized. Doing so would have positioned them far more competitively against emerging manufacturers. But under the continued leadership of Ron Toomer, the company grew complacent, relying on formulas that had worked in the past. Instead of reinvesting in modernization, Aero funneled research and development into experimental ride concepts that never found a market. One such project was Aero's attempt at reviving the early 20th century Virginia Reel Coaster. The concept appeared to place a spinning ride vehicle atop a mine train chassis. A working prototype was even built, but practical issues, including misaligned cars during loading and unloading of riders, prevented the ride from ever being sold. In 1989, Aero began development of what would become one of its most infamous ideas, the pipeline coaster. The concept was to create a track and train system capable of maneuvers not possible with Aero's traditional corkscrew trains. Instead of riding above or below the track, the train would sit between the rails. In practice, the design was deeply flawed. Riders' heads sat dangerously close to the wheels, creating serious safety concerns, such as a rider's hair becoming entangled in the wheel assemblies. The extremely low-riding vehicles made loading and unloading of riders very difficult. To make things worse, manufacturers like B&M soon proved that the same maneuvers could be achieved using far more practical train designs. Ultimately, Aero never sold a single pipeline coaster, and with every missed opportunity, the company drifted further from the cutting edge, setting the stage further for a final desperate gamble. And that gamble was of course X. As B&M rose to dominance and Aero stopped winning major ride contracts, the company entered a new phase, one defined by reinvention. During the early to mid-1990s, a structural engineer named Alan Schilke began working with aerodynamics as a consultant. This would prove to be a turning point, as Alan would later go on to create the Fourth Dimension coaster and ultimately design X itself. Ironically, before consulting for Aero, Alan had originally applied to work at Aero as a junior engineer and was turned down. Instead, he took a position at a nearby structural engineering firm. At the time, Aero did not perform its own structural engineering in-house, and for several upcoming projects, they contracted the very firm Alan worked for. Before long, Allen found himself serving as the lead structural engineer on both Pepsi Max Big One and Desperado, the two tallest roller coasters Arrow had ever built. Shortly afterward, Arrow hired Allen directly, appointing him director of engineering for the ride design department. But by then, Arrow was no longer the company it once was. Coaster sales had slowed down dramatically, and much of the firm's legacy talent had already moved on. Allen was tasked with modernizing Arrow's track design. Under his leadership, the company abandoned its long-standing tangent radius track design philosophy in favor of a far more advanced force vector approach. This shift allowed for smoother transitions, compounding curves, and custom-designed inversions, bringing Arrow's track geometry in line with modern standards. This new design language first appeared in 1996 with the opening of Roller Coaster at Winter Wonderland in Kuwait. While the trains were still classic Arrow corkscrew trains, the track itself was entirely different. Gone were the copy and paste inversions of earlier Arrow coasters, and in their place were smooth, custom-designed, flowing elements. This refined style continued with Roadrunner Express at Six Flags Fiesta Texas and Tennessee Tornado at Dollywood, which is widely regarded as one of Arrow's smoothest and most modern roller coasters. Alongside these improvements, Arrow once again attempted to develop new ride models in the hopes of re-establishing itself in the modern market. Even with the lack of new ride sales, the company was able to stay afloat largely thanks to replacement part sales, as hundreds of Arrow rides were still operating worldwide. But survival wasn't the company's goal. Arrow wanted a comeback. One of these new ride models actually found some success, the Arrow Mad Mouse. It was the company's take on the classic Wild Mouse coaster, featuring an extremely overbuilt support structure that looked ready to survive a nuclear war. Arrow ultimately sold 4 of these rides. For a more intense experience, Arrow developed the Aerobatic, a suspended Wild Mouse coaster where riders sat below the track. This model also introduced Arrow's butterfly harness Restraint, a system that would later be used on X. Despite its more aggressive design style and unique ride maneuvers, the Aerobatic never found a buyer. Around the same time, Arrow revisited the Virginia Reel concept with a redesigned track system, and improved vehicles that allowed for easier loading and unloading of riders. Unlike the original Virginia Reels, this version would have used multi-car trains to increase capacity, but once again, no park took interest. Arrow also proposed the bodiless suspended coaster, which removed the enclosed car bodies on its earlier suspended designs, giving riders a far more open and exposed experience. It would have used an entirely new track system and butterfly harnesses, but like so many other concepts, it never sold. Even as Arrow continued offering its legacy ride models, parks simply were not buying them, and this was with Arrow's newer designs being noticeably smoother than their older counterparts. However, a few years earlier in 1995, Alan Schilke developed another concept, the Fourth Dimension coaster. Inspired by the Zipper, a classic carnival ride built by Chance Rides, Alan wanted to translate the flipping motion of the Zipper into a full-scale roller coaster. Inside Arrow, the project was referred to as the Mystery Project. The biggest challenge with it, however, was controlling the seat rotation. An early idea involved using electric motors to rotate the seats based on the train's position along the track, but it becomes more dangerously complex when applied to vertical rotation, primarily due to moments of high positive g-forces, as every seat must be in the correct orientation, leaving no margin for error. Ultimately, the project was deemed too difficult to engineer, and far too nauseating for the average rider. Thus, Arrow abandoned the concept and shifted resources back to other projects such as the others I mentioned prior. But before it was shelved, the team created a simple 5-second animation, showing a single car rolling down a straight piece of track and performing a backflip. The animation was burned onto a CD and placed in Alan Schilke's desk, where it would sit quietly for years. What the Fourth Dimension coaster needed was someone willing to believe in it. That opportunity arrived in 1998, when Premier Parks acquired the Six Flags chain for $1.86 billion. Now under the leadership of CEO Kieran Burke and President Gary Story, Six Flags entered one of the most aggressive expansion phases in amusement park history. The company went on an almost unrestrained buying spree, acquiring park after park and flooding its properties with new attractions. Some parks received multiple large-scale roller coasters in a single year. In one extreme case, Six Flags Ohio, which you also likely know as Geauga Lake, opened 4 new roller coasters in the year 2000 alone. Many of the smaller parks Six Flags acquired were expanded far too quickly, becoming enormously expensive to operate relative to the attendance they attracted. But among all of Six Flags properties, Magic Mountain stood at the top. Fresh off the opening of Goliath in 2000, Magic Mountain was once again hunting for its next headline attraction. And Gary Story wanted something that would keep the park firmly planted at the center of the coaster wars. In May of 2000, Aerodynamics managed to secure a meeting with Story, hoping to sell him a new ride. Story did not have enough time to visit Aero's facilities in Clearfield, Utah, but he did have time for a meeting at the Salt Lake City International Airport. So that's where it happened. Alan Schilke and 2 other Aero engineers walked Story through the ride concepts they thought would interest him. But as Alan would later recall, they showed Gary the same old rides with tiny little twists. Story was unimpressed. He already had versions of these attractions across his parks. He wanted something new. Unbeknownst to the rest of the team, Alan had something with him, the 4th Dimension coaster animation. Still saved on that same CD, and it was sitting in his backpack. Not wanting the meeting to end in failure, Alan made a split-second decision and played the animation. To his surprise, Story was immediately intrigued. He asked a simple question: can you actually build this? Alan answered confidently that they could. Story made his position clear. He was interested, and he wanted to move forward with a 4th Dimension coaster, but on one condition. Before we could go into contract for one, he needed to see a working prototype first. Aero went straight to work. Designing the 4th Dimension coaster required an unprecedented amount of original engineering. Nothing about it resembled a conventional roller coaster. For the first time, riders would sit to the sides of the track rather than above or below it. Early concepts featured 2 sets of seats cantilevered off the main car chassis, but the track and rotation system were still going through iterations. In an earlier design, the guide wheel sat on the outside of the running rails, and a single seat rotation rail ran down the center of the wide gauge track. That rail would then somehow control the rotation of both sets of seats per car. Instead, Aero adopted a concept Alan had developed in late 1997 or early 1998. The new system used 2 additional rails, one on each side of the track. These would later become known as the X-rails. The X-rails ran parallel to the main running rails and independently controlled the rotation of each pair of seats. To make this work, Aero reverted to a more legacy track configuration with the guide wheels placed on the inside of the rails. They also dramatically narrowed the track gauge and placed the X-rails closer to the cantilevered seats. Now, this narrow track gauge would introduce future problems, but we'll talk about that later in the video. Each pair of seats was controlled by a wheel carrier that rode along the X-rail. Mounted to that carrier was a vertically oriented rack gear, roughly 4 feet tall. As the X-rail shifted closer to or farther from the running rails, it would move the position of the wheel carrier, which would thus move the rack gear up or down. This would spin a pinion gear connected to the seats. The result was a fully mechanical, position-based system that precisely controlled seat rotation, with no motors required. After countless hours of design and fabrication, Aero constructed a working prototype inside their hangar. It stood roughly 20 feet tall and featured a short track layout with a 2-row train. The night before Gary Story and the Six Flags team were scheduled to arrive, Alan and the rest of the team were still working until 4 a.m., prepping the prototype for the 8 a.m. demonstration. The demonstration wound up being a success. Gary Story and members of the Six Flags team even rode the working prototype. Afterward, Story told Aero that he was ready to move forward with a contract. Then came the brutal catch. The ride would be built at Six Flags Magic Mountain, and it could not be small. The ride's location had already been selected: the bus parking lot alongside the park's front entrance road. The new coaster would sit directly in front of Viper, and it had to be taller than Viper, which was already 188 feet tall. Aero was completely stunned. The 4th Dimension coaster was never intended to be built at that scale. The entire concept was based on the idea that rotating seats could deliver extreme thrills without requiring extreme size. In fact, Aero's own promotional material later showed multiple proposed 4D coaster layouts, and none of them were anywhere near X's scale. The tallest concept was just 127 feet tall. Under normal circumstances, Aero should have walked away. But Arrow was not in a position to say no. They needed the sale. The company wanted to become relevant again, and building a full-scale 4D coaster could attract future clients. So Arrow accepted the project, and the company's fate was sealed. Six Flags, however, shares the blame in Arrow's bankruptcy, as they showed little hesitation in ordering another massive, unproven prototype roller coaster. The company had already been burned when they ordered 4 prototype launching shuttle coasters that all opened a year late. A far safer approach would have been to build a smaller 4D coaster first, refine the design and fix any issues, and only then scale it up, just like how Accelerator at Knott's Berry Farm served as the stepping stone toward Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point. But Six Flags did not want a stepping stone. They wanted the biggest version possible immediately, and as we'll discuss later, Six Flags may have had their reasons for doing so. Ultimately, the decision would forever change aerodynamics. Arrow got to work designing what would become X, a project that may have well been the most difficult in the company's history. By December of 2000, the team had reportedly logged more than 22,000 hours of design work, roughly 3 times the effort typically required to design a skyscraper. As a first-of-its-kind roller coaster, X presented an endless list of unprecedented engineering challenges. And to make matters worse, Six Flags demanded that the ride be designed and constructed on an extremely aggressive timeline. Despite the pressure, Arrow completed the design, and on December 19, 2000, Magic Mountain announced the park's largest expansion up until that point. At a cost of $30 million, 3 new roller coasters were scheduled to open in the spring of 2001. This would raise Magic Mountain's coaster count to 15. Giving it the largest roller coaster collection of any park in the world. The park even rebranded itself as the Extreme Park. The smallest of the 3 additions would be Goliath Jr., a revival of Magic Mountain's original kiddie coaster, which had been dismantled and stored since 1999. The second largest would be Deja Vu, a massive first-of-its-kind giant inverted boomerang built by Dutch manufacturer Vekoma. Deja Vu was an unproven prototype roller coaster, and in classic Six Flags fashion of that era, the company did not stop at one Deja Vu. In 2001, Six Flags debuted 3 identical installations, with one at Magic Mountain, another at Six Flags Over Georgia, and the third at Six Flags Great America. This decision would have serious consequences, and as I mentioned earlier, it was not the first time Six Flags had gambled on multiple unproven prototypes at the same time. But the true centerpiece of the Extreme Park was X, the world's first 4th dimension roller coaster. Painted in a bold pink and yellow color scheme, X would loom over the park's front entrance road with a menacing 215-foot nearly vertical first drop. Its rotating seats promised a ride experience unlike anything else on Earth. At the announcement event, Magic Mountain even displayed an X car on site, likely the original Arrow prototype vehicle but dressed up for the occasion. The production trains would ultimately look very different. X was originally announced for a spring 2001 opening, and site preparation began as early as November of 2000. But as construction progressed, it quickly became clear that this timeline was wildly optimistic. Excavation for the ride's massive foundations did not begin until early March of 2001, and this foundation work alone stretched through the end of that month. Because of the extreme weight of the vehicles, a number of the ride's foundations reportedly extended as deep as 80 feet into the ground. In May of 2001, X finally went vertical, with track and supports rising for the 2 stations and lift hill. One unusual detail immediately stood out. The station tracks themselves lacked X-rails, and only featured the 2 main running rails. A short segment of X-rail existed between the stations, but nowhere else within them. As we'll discuss later, this design decision would severely impact operations and cripple dispatch times. Unlike many of Arrow's more recent projects, X was fabricated entirely in-house. In the mid-1990s, Arrow had revived internal fabrication after decades of outsourcing, producing all the track and supports for Tennessee Tornado at Dollywood. The goal was to regain control over schedules and quality, and I'm sure it also reduced the cost of producing their rides, bringing down the overall price tag of the attraction and making their rides more obtainable to amusement parks. But X was nothing like Tennessee Tornado. Because of the ride's prototype nature, Arrow had to completely retool its fabrication shop to manufacture X's massive track, supports, and unprecedented train system. This retooling was enormously expensive, and likely one of the primary reasons Arrow would ultimately lose millions delivering the ride. Six Flags almost certainly paid Arrow in installments, with a substantial amount of payment withheld until final delivery. This meant Arrow was fronting enormous overhead costs while still actively fabricating the ride. Although the company had additional revenue streams, including a reported $750,000 profit for the 2002 Winter Olympics cauldron, those earnings paled in comparison to the scale of X. Arrow's original estimate to design, fabricate, and construct X was reportedly $14 million. The final cost allegedly ballooned to over $45 million. This massive cost discrepancy was likely due to many reasons, such as Arrow greatly underestimating the research and development costs, the cost of retooling their fabrication shop, the massive steel requirements of the ride, and an aggressive construction schedule that spiraled out of control. X alone used over 2.7 million pounds of steel in its track and structure. This is roughly twice the amount of steel used to create Goliath, which is a taller and longer roller coaster than X. And as delays mounted, cost climbed even further as crews worked around the clock correcting emerging issues. To make matters worse, Six Flags allegedly withheld a significant payment until X could operate reliably. There's also evidence that Arrow may have intentionally underbid the project, hoping future 4D coaster sales would offset the loss. Arrow's financial stability was allegedly also tied to a proposed 750-foot tall fishhook coaster planned for the Stratosphere in Las Vegas. When that project was rejected due to its proximity to residential areas, that financial lifeline vanished. By December 2001, after losing millions on X and failing to secure the Stratosphere project, Aerodynamics filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. During reorganization, the company permanently ended its in-house fabrication. However, according to Tim Burkhart, then Six Flags Vice President of Maintenance and Construction, Arrow's financial troubles may have become apparent much earlier. Burkhart stated that Arrow halted fabrication of X mid-project due to its financial issues, leaving Six Flags with no choice but to step in and complete fabrication of the ride themselves. By that point, X was far too long to abandon. Despite the turmoil behind the scenes, construction continued at a steady pace. By mid-June of 2001, X reached its full height, rivaling its neighbor Viper. By the end of June, the massive first drop was complete. By mid-July, the first Raven turn rose into place, followed by the fan curve supports. At the end of July, the final track segment leading into the final brake run was installed, completing vertical construction. To save time, crews had already began the pull-through test prior to track completion with just 2 rows of a train to verify clearances and ensure seat rotation occurred as designed. The ride's terrain played a crucial role in its design. The ground rises beneath the lift hill, allowing the stations, maintenance tracks, and half the brake run to sit closer to ground level. As a result, with just a 175-foot tall lift hill, the ride delivers a 215-foot first drop. On August 10, 2001 at approximately 9:45 p.m., X completed its first full test cycle. The massive train successfully navigated the entire layout and came to a stop on the final brake run. Over the following days, X was cycled repeatedly in the daytime while the park remained open, giving guests a clear view of the enormous 20-foot wide trains racing through the layout. Early test runs were fast, significantly faster than the ride operates today on average. Speeds were high enough that magnetic trim brakes were installed leading into the second Raven turn, followed shortly by additional trims at the base of the first drop. X had been manufactured with 3 locations ready to receive trim brakes. The third location was at the base of the valley between the first Raven turn and Camelback Hill. The ride would eventually open without any of these trims installed, and we'll discuss this in more detail later in the video. You can also see in this early testing footage that the lift hill was originally much faster. However, this high speed would not last, and we'll discuss shortly why that is. Now, while it was fantastic that the ride was finally testing, many issues were already visible. The seat rotation appeared rough and jerky. Even from a distance, the seats could be seen rocking back and forth as they rotated, and they would even wobble on the brake run when there wasn't any rotation occurring. By this point, X had already missed its spring opening, and hopes for a summer debut were fading. By early September, the queue and station buildings appeared complete, but no opening date had been announced. Behind the scenes, there were simply too many problems that remained unresolved. Meanwhile, Deja Vu opened on August 25, 2001, despite battling serious issues of its own. At X, they were just getting started. X's trains were already monsters by design. Each train had a design weight of roughly 50,000 pounds. For comparison, each of Goliath's trains weigh less than half of that at roughly 18,000 pounds. But when X's trains finally arrived at Magic Mountain, they were significantly heavier than their intended design weight, and the fixes required to make them work only pushed that number higher. The trains were originally designed to use forged steel wheels, but the excess weight quickly made that impractical. Arrow was forced to switch to stronger cast wheels, which were heavier themselves, further compounding the problem. And because X rides above and below the track, it requires two sets of large road wheels, with one above the rail and one below the rail. Each of X's trains used 64 of these large road wheels, meaning all 64 suddenly became heavier. On top of that, the trains were vibrating far more than expected. Components throughout the vehicles were experiencing vibration levels well beyond their design limits, forcing crews to rebuild and reinforce large portions of the train. And each reinforcement added more weight to the trains. The most complex modification was the addition of a suspension system between the cantilevered seats and the main chassis. Originally, the trains had no suspension at all. That might sound shocking, but the problem became obvious once testing began. X's running rails are spaced just 3.5 feet apart, yet the trains stretch a staggering 20 feet wide. If you recall the earlier 4D coaster concept, it originally featured a much wider gauge between the running rails, but when Arrow transitioned from a 3-rail to a 4-rail system, the X rails took over that wide spacing at 6 feet 4 inches, forcing the running rails to move significantly closer together. This left the wheel assemblies that carried the full weight of the train positioned far too close to one another relative to the massive width of the vehicles. That narrow running gauge combined with such wide and heavy trains created severe vibrations in the seats, most notably in the outermost seats. Adding the suspension system helped, but once again it likely came at the cost of more weight. According to Alan Schilke, the suspension allowed for up to 5 inches of vertical travel on the outside seats. You can actually see it working with the seats visibly sagging downward during moments of high positive G-forces. Years later, Schilke would admit that X never rode as smoothly as the ride was designed to be. He explained that tubular steel can never be bent to absolute perfection, meaning the ride's design does not translate perfectly to the final product. And in X's case, that limitation was especially critical. While the main running rails sounded glass smooth during testing, and they still do to this day, the X-rails demand far greater precision since they directly control seat rotation. Even the slightest imperfections in these rails can throw off the timing or motion, causing the seats to jerk and oscillate as they rotate. Meanwhile, the same imperfections likely go completely unnoticed on standard running rails, and this is likely made worse by the small gear ratio used in the rack and pinion gears that control X's seat rotation. Because the X-rail can only move up and down within a limited range on the track, the gearing has to translate small movements of the X-rail into large rotations of the seats. But this also means the slightest change in position or imperfection in the X-rail will become noticeable as it will translate to unwanted rotation of the seats. In many ways, the work being done on X was reactionary, similar to what Arrow experienced when building Magnum XL 200 back in 1989. But this time, the stakes were much higher. X was engineered using far more advanced tools and modern design methods. The issue was not outdated technology, the concept itself was simply that extreme. X was an enormously complex prototype, and it was too large to debut something this experimental at full scale. Throughout testing, X's trains were constantly being taken apart and reassembled. Decorative fiberglass panels were removed to expose the chassis. Sections of seatbacks disappeared as crews adjusted the restraint system. Entire sets of cantilevered seats were removed from the trains altogether. Every component was under scrutiny, and every change was an attempt to make these oversized, overweight vehicles function reliably. It's my observation that during this process, another significant change was made to the vehicles to address the challenges created by their massive width and the narrow gauge of the track. Wide-body coaster trains are common today and even existed back then, but X's cantilevered rotating seats introduced tremendous challenges. On a B&M dive coaster, the wide trains are better supported because the two wheel carriers of each car are designed to support the vehicle chassis directly above them. In addition, wider track is used to match the broader trains, creating support points spaced farther apart. This wider stance helps stabilize the vehicle and provides more consistent structural support across the chassis. When X's trains first arrived, however, the roughly 20-foot wide vehicle was supported only at the center of each car by narrowly spaced wheel carriers. Even worse, these wheel carriers did not directly support the chassis above them. In fact, there was a noticeable gap between the top of each wheel assembly and the underside of the vehicle chassis, meaning there was no direct linkage between the two. Instead, a structure spanning between the wheel carriers supported the vehicle from the middle. This configuration left a large portion of the train extending outward on both sides without direct support. As a result, the outer portions of the vehicle were likely subjected to significant vibration, while also experiencing substantial stress and strain during operation. Work quickly began to address this issue, and a new support system was implemented between each wheel carrier and the chassis above it. On the original chassis, the large gray beam running between each pair of seats was smooth. Following the modifications, 4 bolts became visible above each wheel carrier, indicating where the new support structure was, connecting the wheel carriers directly to the chassis. While this change still left a considerable span of the vehicle unsupported toward both edges, it still increased the amount of the train that was structurally supported. This likely helped reduce vibration, improve stability, and lessened the extreme forces acting on the outer portions of the vehicles. However, the modification came at a cost. It added even more weight to the trains that were already notoriously overweight. While engineers struggled with the trains, other construction work continued around the ride. In late September of 2001, irrigation channels were constructed beneath the coaster. In October, large concrete pads were poured in low-lying areas, including the base of the first drop and the bottom of the second Raven turn. And finally, around mid-December, something remarkable happened. 2 of X's trains were spotted fully assembled, no longer in pieces. For the first time, it appeared that the endless list of modifications was complete, and with that, word began to spread that Magic Mountain was preparing to open X. Even with the delay in opening X, when you consider the vast number of changes made to get the ride operating, it's seriously commendable that the team delivered on those challenges that quickly, as other new coasters have been delayed for even longer by seemingly less challenging issues to address. On December 24th, 2001, Christmas Eve, that finally happened. X soft opened to season pass holders. Coaster fans who had followed the project's construction finally got their first rides, and the initial reactions were overwhelmingly positive. Riders described the experience as intense, disorienting, and completely unlike anything else on Earth. Even skeptics who thought the layout looked too short or underwhelming came away shocked by how relentless and non-stop the experience felt. And during the soft opening, there was one rare luxury: short wait times. X would soon become infamous for brutal multi-hour lines, but during the soft opening, season pass holders could ride it multiple times a day with little to no waiting, something that would never really exist again during X's tenure. The experience begins with riders leaving the station backwards, riding above the track. A small dip exiting the station leads into a left-hand turnaround into the lift hill. As the train engages the lift, the seats rotate, placing riders flat on their backs. Then, as the train begins its climb, the seats rotate again, bringing riders upright, giving a breathtaking view of Six Flags Magic Mountain. At the crest of the 175-foot lift, the train dips into a small pre-drop. As it rises again, the seats rotate forward, placing riders face down, as they stare over 200 feet down at the ground below them. The train then careens down the 215-foot skydive drop, pitched at a near vertical 88.6 degrees. The seats leave riders still facing the ground, and as the pullout approaches, the seats execute a front flip, snapping riders upright just as the train bottoms out at 76 miles per hour. The train charges up into the first Raven turn, which starts as a gigantic half loop. Instead of flipping riders upside down, the seats rotate gradually, keeping riders upright as the track inverts around them. Suddenly, riders are riding below the track facing forward. If you were in the front car, the rest of the train suddenly disappears from your view. And if you were in the back car, the rest of the train suddenly becomes in front of you. The half loop transitions into a massive parabolic drop. As the train descends, the seats rotate again, placing riders into a flying position, before snapping upright just before the pullout, delivering a great pop of airtime. The train races through another tight valley as it flies through a series of dense supports with riders' feet nearly touching the ground. The train climbs into an airtime hill where the seats perform a backflip, leaving riders weightless through the entire maneuver. The track passes high above the station, then rises into the luge turn, a slower, more drawn-out moment with no seat rotation, where riders remain facing forward beneath the track. The pacing then surges again as the train drops back to ground. The track quickly unbanks, delivering a great pop of airtime due to the wide-body trains. The train races through more dense supports as it enters the twisting flip. The track rolls from inverted to upright while the seats rotate through a half front flip, delivering airtime in the process. The twisting flip leaves riders traveling backwards above the track as they exit the element. Next comes the ride's most intense moment, the second Raven turn. It begins like an airtime hill, but the seats rotate forward, putting riders in a flying position. At the crest, the track curves left and dives into a tight half loop that plummets back to Earth. Through the loop, the seats rotate again to keep riders upright as they blast through another very low to the ground valley. The train rises into another twisting flip. The track rolls upright and the seats rotate through a half backflip, and riders once again find themselves traveling backwards above the track as the train is slowed by the magnetic brake system. Notably, X uses both magnetic and friction brakes, with the two systems sitting parallel to each other, so two separate brake fins are mounted beneath each car, adding even more weight to the already massive trains. What's fascinating is how the seat rotation system reshapes the entire layout. On paper, X is surprisingly simple with not many hills compared to the size of the first drop. Nitro at Six Flags Great Adventure also has a 215-foot first drop, but has a much longer track length at 5,394 feet, compared to X's track length at 3,610 feet. Thus, X is strikingly short in length compared to other rides of similar height and speed. That's because the wide-body vehicles create significantly more air resistance, and the additional wheel assemblies riding the X-rails add friction. The seat rotation system likely drains kinetic energy also, as forward momentum is partially converted into rotational energy to spin the seats. So even with the incredibly heavy trains, all those factors are likely why the second Raven turn is dramatically shorter than the first one, even if there's only 3 hills between the 2 Raven turns, as there are more variables that slow down the trains compared to a more typical roller coaster. Going back to X's soft opening, the most surreal part of it was that it was not just a preview. The ride was still ongoing heavy modifications while it operated with guests. On December 24, 2001, mechanics were actively working on one of the 2 operational trains each time it returned to the station. This train was cycled empty for hours as this work continued. X also features station gates that raise between each row of the train to prevent riders from climbing onto the track. During the soft opening, the gates would commonly not raise or lower, and crews worked on them in real time as guests continued riding the coaster. The mechanically driven restraints were frequently jamming and failing to unlock when trains returned to the unload station. Alan Schilke was reportedly present and personally assisted in releasing many guests who got stuck in the trains. X also features a seat rotation system in the station, which rotates the seats upright for unloading and loading, and rotates them back for motion. Well, the system was commonly malfunctioning and sets of seats would fail to rotate, forcing mechanics and ride operators to physically push and shake the seats to get the actuator to move. This technical rehearsal continued for weeks as Arrow and Six Flags worked to address the ride's many operational quirks. Then on January 12, 2002, Magic Mountain hosted X's official media day. Excitement was in the air as the press and media took their first official rides. Afterwards, the general public flooded the queue. Reports say the line stretched all the way across the new bridge leading to X and snaked down the hill to Revolution. There was no question, X was a hit. Thrill seekers were coming to Magic Mountain in flocks to ride the coaster, exactly as the ride was designed to do. But beyond the excitement, a problem was already glaring. X could not move riders through its line fast enough. When X was announced, it was promoted the ride could run 3 trains, each holding 28 riders, with a theoretical hourly capacity of 1,680 riders per hour. The ride featured a separate load and unload station, and its block zones were engineered to allow 3 train operations safely. For those of you who are unfamiliar, a block zone is a section of ride that only one train may occupy. At the end of a block zone is a method to stop a train in case the block zone ahead is still occupied. This is the safety system that prevents roller coaster trains from colliding with one another. X was equipped with the following blocks. First was the load station block, then the lift hill block, then the ready brake block, which encompasses the entire ride layout, ending with the first portion of final brake run, then the transfer track block, and lastly the unload station block. So a total of 5 block zones, easily allowing for 3 train operations. Achieving the theoretical capacity requires a train to dispatch from the load station every 60 seconds, equating to 60 dispatches an hour. In practice, this was impossible. Starting with the lift hill, which is the ride's longest block zone time-wise, the 200 horsepower motors powering it were initially capable of the intended speed during testing. It took roughly 60 seconds from when a train dispatched from the load station to when it disengaged the lift, aligning with the advertised theoretical capacity. Even the timing of the ride's original animation aligns exactly with the 60-second time frame. But with the trains being so overweight, the intended lift speed could not be reliably maintained. By the soft opening, the lift had already been slowed down. Based on videos recorded a few years later, it took about 80 seconds from when a train dispatched from the load station to when it disengaged the lift. That alone reduced the ride's theoretical capacity to roughly 1,260 riders per hour. However, many other factors made even this number impossible. The seat rotation system in the stations was the real bottleneck. Remember how some of the station tracks were missing X-rails during construction? That's because the stations relied on movable X-rails powered by actuators to rotate the seats for unloading and loading of riders, as well as motion of the trains. Each train had to go through multiple seat rotations in the stations, with each rotation adding more time to each dispatch. First was the unload rotation, when trains returned from the circuit and parked in the unload station. The train would first park and wait for the station gates to raise between each row of the train, and then after a brief pause, the seats were rotated upright, which unlocked the restraints in the process. Second was a preload rotation. Because of a fixed segment of X-rail between the 2 stations, the seats had to be rotated back so that the movable X-rails matched the position of the fixed X-rail. Only then could the train be advanced to the load station. Next was the third rotation, the load rotation. When the train parked in the load station, its seats had to be once again rotated upright so that riders could actually board into their seats. After ride attendants made their first check of the restraints from in front of the seats completed their 4th and final rotation as they were rotated back to match the fixed X-rail leaving the station. Rotating the seats for motion was also a necessity as it provided the clearance between riders' legs and the fixed station floor. However, further slowing down operations was a mandatory second restraint check, which occurred after the final seat rotation. Attendants made the second check from behind each seat, ensuring the restraints were still properly positioned against all riders. Then to make things even worse, X commonly operated with just one train on the track. As we'll discuss later, each train required a tedious amount of maintenance to keep them running, so it became quite the norm for just one train to be available. And even with ride operators trying their best, these combined conditions forced dispatches to be painfully slow. Early reports indicated as much as 10 minutes between each dispatch, with the attraction averaging roughly 200 riders per hour, a far cry from the ride's theoretical 1,680 riders per hour. The result of this was that guests often waited 4 hours or more to get on X. and in the process they baked in the sun because the queue vegetation hadn't matured and shade was minimal. During summer months, combined with Magic Mountain's heat, some guests even fainted in line. And towards the end of the day, the park would not close the queue early. If the park officially closed at 10 p.m., guests could still enter the line, forcing the ride to cycle well past midnight, sometimes into the early morning hours, just to accommodate the massive crowds. In another interesting twist, the automatic locking and unlocking of X's restraints was directly dependent on the rotation of the seats within the station. The original X trains relied on a more traditional analog restraint system, one similar to what Arrow had long used on its suspended coasters. In this system, a lever arm fitted with a roller wheel was mounted beneath each car body. By default, the restraints remained locked. To unlock them, actuators embedded in the station floor would rise upward and push the lever arms, mechanically releasing the restraints. However, X's cantilevered seating arrangement quickly complicated what was normally a very simple system. A single lever arm per car would not work, as the two pairs of seats in each car were separated by a substantial distance. As a result, each pair of seats required its own lever arm. In fact, each pair of seats used two different lever arms. These lever arms featured white roller wheels at their ends, one positioned closer to the track and another located beneath the inside seat. This meant that instead of a single lever per car, each car was now equipped with 4 separate levers. The lever closest to the track was used in the unload station. As the seats rotated upright, this lever was pushed upward by a fixed piece attached to the station platform, unlocking the restraints before the seats had fully completed their rotation. Attendants in the unload station would then ensure all harnesses were fully open. When the seats rotated again for movement toward the load station, the lever lost contact with the fixed piece, causing the restraints to lock once more. When the train parked in the load station and the seats were rotated upright again, a different lever, the one beneath the inside seat, came into play. This lever rested on top of actuators built directly into the station floor. Presumably, these actuators could be raised by the control system to unlock the restraints if needed. Under ideal operation, however, they rarely had to do anything. Each train was intended to return to the load station with all harnesses already open and locked, ready for the next group of riders to board and secure themselves. Even so, this setup still required 14 separate actuators in total, as each pair of seats needed its own dedicated unit. I've heard several accounts suggesting that these load station actuators may have been part of the reason X required a double restraint check. Allegedly, as the seats rotated, the lever arms could momentarily contact the actuators, briefly unlocking the restraints. As a precaution, a second restraint check was performed after the seats were rotated into their dispatch position, ensuring that all riders were still properly secured before the train was cleared to leave the station. Interestingly, looking back at the unload station, it appears that cutouts were originally made in the concrete for a similar actuator-based system, like the one used in the load station. However, at some point during development, it seems the decision was made to instead use a separate lever arm and fixed rail to unlock the restraints in the unload station. In addition to the lever arms, the original trains also featured 2 other arms beneath each seat that lacked roller wheels entirely. These odd extensions would comically flop around as the seats rotated throughout the ride layout. As further modifications were made to the trains, which we'll discuss shortly, these strange appendages were eventually removed altogether. The butterfly restraints themselves were also highly unconventional. They allowed for a remarkable range of adjustment, allowing them to fit riders of all different sizes with near glove-like precision. I'll let Alan Schilke explain their design in more detail.
It's got a vertical butterfly adjustment, and it also moves up and down. But I'll get in and show you how it works. When you get in the coaster, the first thing you want to do is pull the restraint down, which is kind of what's revolutionary. When you close this in on you, it fits you both on the shoulders, in the chest, and for the smaller people, it even fits you on the thighs. You got the safety belt, so from this position here, that's when you'll be exiting out the back of the station and ready for your ride.
Unfortunately, this flexibility came at a significant cost. The restraints were highly mechanical, relying on a complex system of springs and cables linked directly to the lever arms to control locking and unlocking. On top of that, this same mechanical system also controlled the motion of the butterfly restraint and the vertical movement of the entire seat. As a result, the system was extraordinarily complex and quite prone to jamming. The restraints also connected to the infamous manual release pedals mounted along the sides of each pair of seats. These pedals were frequently used by attendants in the load station to adjust restraints when riders secured themselves incorrectly. Because of how adjustable the restraints were, riders of different body types often needed to secure them in different ways. For some, it worked best to first pull the restraint down to their shoulders and then close the butterfly harness. For others, the opposite approach was best. When a restraint was closed incorrectly, attendants would use the manual release pedals to make adjustments. However, the process was anything but smooth. The pedal had to be held down continuously to keep the restraint unlocked, forcing attendants to awkwardly reach over the outer seat to adjust the inner one. The restraints themselves were also heavy, further complicating the process. To make matters worse, the pedals frequently jammed, and there are many accounts of attendants having to physically jump on them to get the restraints to release. In the end, while the butterfly harnesses offered an impressive level of adjustability, they also introduced a host of operational challenges. The frequent need for awkward manual restraint adjustments significantly slowed dispatches, and played a major role in the ride's notoriously poor capacity. Later in the video, we'll take a look at how the redesigned trains for X2 addressed and largely resolved many of these issues. The operational situation at X remained bleak. Even though the ride had finally opened, bringing an end to months of delays, Arrow was allegedly pressured into handing the attraction over to Magic Mountain earlier than they would have preferred. And as we'll discuss shortly, once that handoff occurred, Arrow may have no longer been in a position to meaningfully assist Magic Mountain in resolving the ride's growing list of problems. With the ride vehicles being so severely overweight, the trains were tedious to maintain, and required an extraordinary amount of time and replacement parts to keep operational. This was a major reason why X most often ran with just one of its 3 trains in service. It's also alleged that Magic Mountain continued making modifications to the trains on their own in an effort to improve reliability, as the trains were struggling under their excess weight. However, some of these changes may have only introduced new issues, further complicating an already fragile system. As a result, X continued operating with staggeringly slow dispatches and 4-hour queues well into June. Then on June 12, 2002, Magic Mountain abruptly announced that X would be closed indefinitely due to design issues. The timing was jarring, coming just days before the start of the busy summer season. A few nights earlier, an alleged incident had occurred on X after the park had closed for the night. As was typical at the time, X's queue stretched on for hours, and the ride continued operating late into the night as it slowly worked its way through the remaining line. To understand what happened, it's important to revisit just how heavy and complex X's trains really were. A significant portion of that weight came from the seat support system required for each pair of cantilevered seats. Each pair was supported by 2 large cylindrical beams known as pickle forks. One pickle fork sat behind the headrests while the other was positioned beneath the seat bottoms. These pickle forks were welded to a large steel assembly that connected them to the seat rotation mechanism. Together, this structure provided the primary support for each pair of seats. Note that the entire seat support system was originally painted purple. This will be important later in the video. On that night in early June of 2002, when a train completed the circuit, something was immediately wrong. One of the outside seats near the back of the train was visibly out of position, noticeably leaning to the side. Allegedly, the seat support system for that set of seats had failed in some way during the ride cycle. Even more concerning, the rider occupying that outside seat had reportedly completed an unknown portion of the layout with their seat in this incorrect position. Thankfully, the rider was not injured. Magic Mountain shut down X immediately for the night and began clearing the still lengthy queue of guests waiting to ride. Some of these guests had already waited 4 hours or more and were just moments away from boarding, only to have that time completely wasted. I can only imagine how outraged some of these people were. However, this was 2002. Smartphones did not exist, and no one had a pocket-sized 4K camera with instant access to social media. As a result, word of the incident barely spread at all. Compounding that, the damaged seat was located near the back of the train, so guests waiting at the load platform were unable to see the damaged seat. Had this incident occurred today, it almost certainly would have gone viral within hours and dominated headlines. Instead, it largely slipped under the radar. A 28-year-old woman had tragically died after riding Goliath just a year earlier on June 2nd, 2001. While the incident was ultimately attributed to pre-existing medical conditions, Magic Mountain was still dealing with the public backlash of that. So it's hard not to wonder what further damage might have been done to the park's reputation had X's incident also broken into mainstream news at the time. Shortly after the shutdown, on June 18, 2002, X was spotted testing again as work began to correct issues with the trains. Notably, at this point, the seat support system was still painted purple. However, behind the scenes, the situation surrounding X and aerodynamics may have been far more dramatic. As discussed earlier, Aero had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in December of 2001, and the prolonged delays and operational failures of X played a significant role in pushing the company to that point. Compounding matters further, Six Flags had entered into multiple arbitration claims against Aero totaling roughly $5.8 million. From what I understand, a potential final nail in the coffin may have been Six Flags withholding the final payment for X, citing that the payment would only be made once X could operate reliably. And from what I understand, this final payment was never made. So as a result of X's ongoing issues, Aero never received the final payment for the ride on top of Magic Mountain's $5.8 million of claims for the project. Reflecting to earlier in the video where we discussed Six Flags buying so many unproven experimental rides, this may have been their tactic. The company may have expected these prototype attractions to not work correctly, requiring months of delays and many modifications. And as a result, Six Flags would never have to fully pay for these rides, as they would cite discontent with the ride's reliability. This practice was likely at play when Six Flags purchased X, the 3 Deja Vu coasters, and many more attractions. And in a way, it makes sense, as Six Flags had purchased so many parks at this point, and were now pumping their long list of properties with attraction after attraction. So the company may have used a practice like this so that they could keep up with their unhinged expansion. With X allegedly handed off to Magic Mountain earlier than Aero would have preferred, the park suddenly assumed much of the responsibility for maintaining and correcting the ride's ongoing issues. The scope of those problems and the pressure to resolve them appears to have been overwhelming. By May of 2002, multiple parties were submitting bids to purchase Aero and its remaining assets. Somewhat surprisingly, Six Flags was among them. However, Six Flags did not look to purchase Aero itself, but only its assets related specifically to the 4D coaster for just $10,000, along with a promise to discharge the $5.8 million in claims they had filed against the company. Aero's president, Fred Bolingbroke, strongly objected to the proposal. The prevailing theory is that Six Flags was desperately searching for a more permanent solution to X's train issues, but needed access to Aero's proprietary 4D coaster assets, either to resolve the problems internally or to bring in another ride manufacturer to do so. Ultimately, the offer from Six Flags, along with several others, was rejected by Aero's unsecured creditors committee. As many coaster enthusiasts know, in October of 2002, S&S, another Utah-based ride manufacturer, successfully acquired Aero and its assets. Fortunately, before that acquisition took place, the necessary modifications to X's trains were completed, and the ride officially reopened on August 13, 2002. While it's unclear exactly what parties completed the repairs, it was likely a collaborative effort between Aero and Six Flags engineers. One immediately noticeable change was the seat support structure. The pickle forks and the large steel assemblies were no longer painted purple, and instead matched the gray color of the main chassis above the track. It's my understanding that the seat support structures were entirely replaced with stronger components, and the joints between the pickle forks and steel assemblies were significantly reinforced. The removal of the purple paint may have also been intentional, as it likely made inspections easier and may have prevented paint from masking early signs of metal fatigue. I also believe that during this round of modifications, the mysterious second arms beneath the seats were removed entirely from all trains. From this point forward, only the primary lever arms with white roller wheels remained. Around the same time, Magic Mountain installed a support structure for a canopy along the pathway leading to X's queue. A very practical addition given how frequently the line extended far beyond the ride's actual entrance. X was now back in operation. However, with these reinforcements in place, it's reasonable to assume that the trains became even heavier than before. Reports indicate that the lift speed was reduced further, and this is likely when the timing from when a train dispatched from the station to when it disengaged the lift became 80 seconds. Fortunately, one of X's greatest design strengths avoided any further problems. As we've already discussed, the trains were delivered to Magic Mountain well beyond their intended design weight, and as modifications were introduced to address the ride's many mechanical issues, the vehicles only became heavier. The track and support system would have originally been engineered around a train weight of 50,000 pounds. However, according to an archive of Magic Mountain's website from February of 2002, each car of X's train weighed approximately 5 tons or 10,000 pounds. Across 7 rows, that places the train at 70,000 pounds. And that figure does not include the trailing 0 car at the rear, which added additional weight. Once you factor in the numerous structural reinforcements and retrofits made to the trains, I think it's reasonable to estimate a total train weight of approximately 80,000 pounds, more than 4 times the weight of a Goliath train, which comes in at roughly 18,000 pounds. For most roller coasters, a weight increase of roughly 30,000 pounds to the vehicles would be catastrophic on the track and structure. Let alone, most roller coaster vehicles do not even weigh 30,000 pounds. But this is where X never truly struggled. In the words of Tim Burkhart, the challenge of maintaining X had always been the vehicles. X's track and column structure is as close to bulletproof as a structure that he has ever seen on a roller coaster. Much like Arrow's Mad Mouse coasters, X was designed and constructed with an exceptionally overbuilt track and support system. To start, the X rails greatly increased the strength of the track. Rather than relying on 2 running rails like a conventional coaster, X's track has 4 rails, which dramatically increases stiffness and strength. In high-stress areas, Arrow further reinforced the track with the double strongback. The strongback is the large tubular spine that sits below the rails and cross ties, and in areas of less stress, there is just a single strongback. The cross ties themselves are also quite thick and reinforced, and they are spaced much closely together in these high-stress areas, further increasing rigidity of the track where it's most needed. The support structure is equally robust. Columns appear in far greater numbers than on typical steel coasters, especially in high-stress areas such as the valleys between drops. Even in lower stress sections of the layout, the support density remains well above average. As mentioned earlier, X's track and structure contains roughly 2.7 million pounds of steel, about double that of Goliath, even though Goliath is a taller and longer ride, and much of that likely comes from the use of significantly thicker steel members, along with the ride's more densely placed track and support system. Many of the ride's foundations also extend as deep as 80 feet into the ground, anchoring the structure with extraordinary stability. Had X not been built with such an over-engineered, near-bulletproof structure, its problems would have extended far beyond the vehicles themselves, and the ride's troubled early years could have ended very differently. However, the overburdening weight was too much on the ride vehicles themselves, as we saw with the 2002 accident and all the modifications required to keep the trains running somewhat reliably. X would continue operating over the next several years in a far less eventful manner. By this point, most of the ride's most alarming issues had been resolved, and extended closures were no longer common. That's not to say the ride was operating ideally. While the park had seemingly brought X's situation under control, the vehicles themselves still required an immense amount of attention and money to keep running, far more than the average roller coaster. Because the trains exceeded their design weight by such a significant margin, component wear was extreme. X reportedly went through wheels at an astonishing rate, requiring as many as 18 to 20 road wheel replacements per day. Considering that roller coaster wheels can cost several $1,000s each, X may have cost Magic Mountain $40,000 or more per day in wheels alone, which is completely insane. And the madness did not stop there. The trains required constant and intensive inspection to ensure the chassis and all other critical components remained structurally sound. While it's standard industry practice for ride vehicles to undergo annual non-destructive testing, or NDT, X's trains required far more intensive third-party NDT to verify their continued structural integrity. All things considered, while the most alarming problems had largely been solved, the maintenance burden and operating costs required to keep X running were far from ideal. This made 3-train operation impossible, as there simply wasn't enough time to perform the rigorous maintenance required on all 3 trains each day. Even maintaining 2 trains proved challenging, making 1-train operation frustratingly common. And with the ride being so punishing on its vehicles, the strain eventually became permanent. At some point during X's tenure, one of the 3 trains was retired altogether after reaching the end of its service life in just a few short years. The remaining trains were not far behind, as the sheer weight of the vehicles made them prone to quite literally tearing themselves apart. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that during X's initial testing phase in 2001, magnetic trim brakes were installed in 2 locations. However, by the time the ride officially opened, those trims had been removed. I believe this decision was largely influenced by X's placement within Magic Mountain. From a visual standpoint, the location was perfect, with the ride looming over the park's entrance road like a mechanical monster, but functionally, it was far from ideal. Unlike most of the rides at Magic Mountain, X was built directly in front of the hill at the center of the park, making it very susceptible to high wind conditions. Combine that with its enormous wide trains, and you effectively have sails in the wind, even with their sheer mass. As a result, X developed a well-earned reputation for valleying, where a train loses too much speed and fails to crest a hill, causing it to roll back and forth between 2 high points until it settles. This most commonly occurred during early morning test runs when trains were empty of riders. Here's an example from 2005 showing a train valleyed between the Camelback and the Luge turn. This location is where trains most commonly valleyed on X, and still to this day on X2. While X would commonly cycle its track very fast, taking roughly 40 seconds from when it disengaged the lift to when it entered the final brake run, placing magnetic trim brakes that could not be turned off would be a struggle when the ride ran more slowly in certain conditions. The magnetic trim brakes were fixed and thus always active and could only be quote-unquote turned off by removing them from the track, similar to the trim brakes used on this hill on Pantherion at King's Dominion. This is likely the reason why those trims were removed and never put back. With rides that are prone to valleying, parks will commonly add weight to the trains in the form of water dummies for the first several cycles of the day. I personally have experience with this from operating El Toro at Six Flags Great Adventure, as well as Millennium Force at Cedar Point. However, from what I understand, additional weight was never really added to X's trains for morning test runs, and I believe this is because the trains were already so heavy to begin with, meaning the weight of water dummies or riders hardly makes a difference. Assuming an average rider weight of 175 pounds, 28 riders is 4,900 pounds. If X's trains weighed 80,000 pounds while empty of riders, the addition of 4,900 pounds of weight is just a 6.1% difference. For comparison, each of Goliath's trains hold 30 riders, so that's a weight of 5,250 pounds. Adding this weight to Goliath's much lighter 18,000 pound trains yields a 29.2% difference. When X first opened, there were no catwalks beneath the high valleys leading into and out of the luge turn. It's likely that X's tendency to valley became apparent fairly early in its lifespan. Following the ride's reopening in the summer of 2002, catwalks were installed beneath both of these high valleys. Their primary purpose was likely to assist with train recovery, and potentially to allow for rider evacuation if a train ever valleyed with riders on board. And frankly, I would hate to be the person responsible for recovering a train this massive. Given their extraordinary weight and size, the safest approach would likely be to remove the train car by car, then transport them back to the storage track and reassemble the train, rather than attempting to hoist the entire vehicle over the next hill and then release it to complete the circuit. However, X's trains make the process of removing them from the track incredibly complicated. This isn't just a matter of removing a set of wheels and lifting the car away. Each vehicle is also connected to the track via the X-rail wheel carrier, which would need to be partially disassembled first. On top of that, the sheer width of the vehicles, especially in inverted sections such as the valleys into and out of the luge turn, could require multiple cranes working in tandem just to safely extract a single car. I sincerely hope that X2 never valleys again, but if it ever does, I have to admit, I'd be fascinated to see how that recovery is actually carried out. In the meantime, S&S, now with Aero under its wing, was charging forward with major improvements to the 4D coaster concept. These advancements were substantial enough that Fuji-Q Highland ultimately took the leap. And on July 19, 2006, the park officially debuted the world's second 4D coaster, Eejanaika. To this day, Eejanaika remains my favorite roller coaster I have ever ridden. Interestingly, Eejanaika was not built at a smaller scale as Aero had once envisioned for future installations. Instead, it was constructed even taller, faster, and longer than X. Nearly every aspect of the ride experience was also amplified. While Eejanaika's layout remains broadly similar to X's, many of the slower or less engaging moments found on X were replaced with far more dynamic elements. Overall, Eejanaika is a lot more intense than X while also being smoother. I won't go into a full breakdown of Eejanaika's vastly superior ride experience here, but be sure to check out my full review video for a detailed breakdown and direct comparison to X2. For this video though, let's focus on the technological advancements that made Eejanaika possible, starting with the track and support system. Just like X, Eejanaika features a dense support system. However, its track utilizes a double strongback through the entire layout, whereas X only employed a double strongback in its most intense sections and relied on a single strongback through less demanding elements. In short, Eejanaika is that intense that the entire ride layout requires the double strongback. Eejanaika also operates with trains that are just 5 cars long, compared to X's 7-car trains. This shorter configuration significantly reduces overall train weight, placing less stress on the track and support structure, while also allowing for a far more dynamic ride experience. While X noticeably slows down near the peaks of its hills, Eejanaika maintains a breathtaking pace through every single element. The 5-car train makes this possible, as acceleration is more consistent across a shorter train than it is with a longer one. However, the longer train used on X2 means that I prefer X2's first drop in the back car compared to Eejanaika's first drop in its back car. Beyond enhancing the ride experience, I believe the increased pacing found on Eejanaika serves a few practical purposes also. One was to reduce the likelihood of valleying, which was a big issue with X and continues to be one with X2. Another may have been to improve seat rotation smoothness. While Eejanaika is certainly not perfectly smooth, I found it to exhibit far less seat jerking compared to X2. While this improvement is probably aided by a more precise manufacturing process, resulting in X-rails that are far truer to their intended design, I also believe faster seat rotations play a role. Prolonged rotations require longer stretches of X-rail to manage seat movement, increasing the likelihood that any small imperfection translates into a noticeable jerk. To improve operations, seat rotation within the station was completely abandoned. Instead, the entire station floor drops out of the way, allowing trains to enter the station and dispatch with the seats already in the upright position, since clearance between riders' feet and the floor is no longer an issue. The station floor can raise and lower a bit more quickly than X's seats could rotate, saving some time with each cycle. This approach also dramatically reduces the mechanical complexity. The X-rails in the station remained fixed, whereas X featured 7 pairs of actuating X rails per station platform. Additionally, the gates protecting riders from the track are mechanically linked to the moving station floor, further simplifying the system. On X, each gate required its own dedicated actuator. Eejanaika also features just a single station position, where all loading and unloading occurs. Overall, it's a much more elegant and streamlined setup, though operations are still relatively slow due to the addition of a waist seatbelt and multiple restraint checks. But this is due to protocols put in place by the park, not the manufacturer. Perhaps the most striking upgrade with Eejanaika was its original ride vehicles. While they appeared visually similar to X's original trains, they were actually a second generation 4D coaster vehicle, and many of the improvements introduced here would later carry over into the third generation trains developed for X2. The most significant change lies in the main steel chassis, which rides directly above the track and supports the 2 sets of cantilevered seats. On Eejanaika, this black chassis features numerous cutouts, whereas X's gray chassis was a solid piece. These openings remove a tremendous amount of weight while still maintaining the required structural strength. Additionally, the wheel carriers that ride along the X rails debuted as a single-piece design on Eejanaika, saving even more weight compared to the multi-piece carriers used on X, which were designed to be disassembled. Another significant change was that the primary wheel carriers for the main running rails were now designed to directly support the chassis above them, unlike X's original trains as we discussed earlier in the video. The shape of the chassis even aligned with this, as it grew wider and circular on top of each wheel carrier. Several suspension refinements were incorporated as well. Here we see the seats visibly sagging downward. That is the suspension at work. The gray hard rubber ring shown here is the suspension element, and it reduces vibration in the cantilevered seats. It's reportedly an improvement upon the retrofit solution applied to X. Additionally, a shock absorber was installed between the X-rail wheel carrier and the rack gear. This dampener helped to smoothen out any imperfections in the X-rail, translating to smoother rotations of the seats. X's original trains actually lacked this dampening piece, and the rack gears connected directly to the X-rail wheel carriers. X also became infamous for wearing through its road wheels far too quickly, making the ride extraordinarily expensive to operate. So for Eejanaika, it appears that S&S made both the upper and lower road wheels much larger. This was likely an effort to reduce wheel wear and extend their service life, which in the end would make Eejanaika both cheaper to operate and less difficult to maintain. It also appears that suspension upgrades were added above each wheel carrier. This here looks like the bottom of a shock absorber. Another major upgrade was the transition away from X's mechanical restraint unlocking system to a wireless electronic control system. Rather than relying on levers and actuators, each pair of seats was connected to a signal amplifier mounted on the seat supports. The signal amplifier relayed information to a wireless transceiver mounted on the zero car at the rear of the train. The ride's control system then communicated with this transceiver, allowing operators to both control and monitor the restraints across the entire train. This allowed the control system to also verify the position of each individual restraint, which prevented the train from dispatching until all of the restraints were fully closed. This represented a significant improvement over X's original analog system, which did not actively verify restraint positions, and actually allowed trains to dispatch even if restraints were still open. Here we see a train cycling the track, and these unoccupied seats have their restraints completely open. Overall, the new system eliminated the lever arms beneath each pair of seats and the actuators embedded in the station floor, greatly reducing both mechanical complexity and overall weight compared to X. It also replaced the notoriously finicky manual release pedals with simple manual release buttons mounted behind each seat. With the press of a button, ride attendants could release each harness individually, eliminating the need to jump on pedals and reaching over harnesses to free stuck restraints. Altogether, even with adding so many components, these second generation trains saved over 1,000 pounds per car compared to X's original vehicles. And despite the lighter trains, Eejanaika was equipped with a far more powerful lift system, with its 2 lift motors producing roughly 800 horsepower, whereas X's 2 lift motors produce only 400 horsepower. This weaker motor setup, combined with trains that greatly exceeded their intended design weight, ultimately led to X's notoriously slow lift hill. Shortly after Eejanaika's grand opening, X would suffer an even longer closure than its infamous shutdown in the summer of 2002. In August of 2006, a gearbox in X's lift motor system failed, bringing the coaster to a halt. The ride did not reopen until February of 2007. Ironically, this outage stretched on for much longer than the 2002 shutdown, when the coaster's most complex components, the ride vehicles, had to be re-engineered. When X finally reopened in early 2007, it would not be much longer before the ride was slated for a far more permanent transformation. On November 1st, 2007, Magic Mountain announced that X would undergo a $10 million overhaul, emerging as X2. The ride would receive a bold new red and dark gray color scheme, and state-of-the-art visual, audio, and sensory effects. But the centerpiece of this transformation, and the entire reason for it, was the introduction of an all-new third-generation train design, which would be drastically lighter than the original X trains to greatly increase the ride's reliability and operations. X officially closed on December 2nd, 2007, as work began on the conversion to X2. The faded pink track and yellow supports were gradually repainted in their new, more menacing colors. In early 2008, the new trains began arriving at Magic Mountain, and with them came the full story behind their development. It turns out design work on these third-generation vehicles had begun nearly 3 years prior. In early 2005, Six Flags worked closely with S&S to remove weight wherever possible while reinforcing key structural areas. That effort likely created the second-generation trains that debuted on Eejanaika. As a result, X2's vehicles incorporated all of Eejanaika's advancements and then pushed even further. Like on Eejanaika, the main chassis riding above the track was no longer solid, instead featuring numerous cutouts to reduce weight while maintaining the needed strength. The wheel carriers for the running rails now directly supported the chassis above them. The X-Rail wheel carriers were redesigned as single-piece assemblies, replacing the heavier carriers used on the original trains, which were modular and could be taken apart piece by piece. X2's new trains also incorporated the shock absorber added between the gear rack and X-Rail wheel carrier first seen on Eejanaika's second-generation trains. The Restraint system saw further refinement over Eejanaika's. The Restraint locking mechanism and actuators were significantly redesigned to improve their reliability. The trains were also equipped with a new onboard pneumatic system, meaning air pressure now unlocked the restraints. To make it work, a new air hose was installed at the start of the load station track, and it would raise into place to plug into each train. This allowed for the elimination of the mechanical restraint release system used on X, which relied on a network of cables, levers, station floor actuators, and the infamous manual release pedals. X2's trains also received manual restraint release buttons, and they were moved to a new panel at the edge of each pair of seats, making them even easier for attendants to access compared to Eejanaika's buttons. While Eejanaika's trains had already shed over 1,000 pounds per car compared to X's original vehicles, X2's trains went even further. Eejanaika still used large decorative fiberglass panels over the main chassis and gear racks, just like X had. On X, the fiberglass extended to form an X around the gear rack as part of its theming. For X2, however, all of this fiberglass was eliminated in the pursuit of weight savings, giving the trains a much more stripped-down appearance. The only major plastic element retained was the elephant ear, the large safety panel between the inner seat and gear system. But the most significant change for the third-generation vehicles came with an entirely new seat support system. From day one, the original cantilevered seat supports had proven to be one of the first-generation train's biggest weaknesses. This was especially evident during the ride's alleged incident in June of 2002. Beyond safety concerns, the system was heavy and contributed to the ride's roughness. For X2, the original pickle fork design, which had two thick tubular beams, was replaced with what became known as the pickled spoon. This new configuration used a thinner steel assembly that wrapped around both seats and incorporated weight-saving cutouts much like the main chassis. The result was a structure that was both lighter and stronger, reducing overhung mass on either side of the train and placing less strain on the entire vehicle. On paper, this alone promised a significantly smoother ride. Altogether, X2's new trains weighed roughly 20,000 pounds less than X's originals, meaning S&S and Six Flags managed to remove more mass from each train than an entire Goliath train weighs. Interestingly, X2's trains do not use the larger road wheels that debuted on Eejanaika's second-generation trains, and this was likely for two reasons. With the third generation trains being drastically lighter, the larger road wheels were no longer needed. On top of that, the larger road wheels are also much heavier, so continuing to use the smaller wheels helped achieve the weight loss of 20,000 pounds. With the trains being so much lighter, it also allowed for the use of lighter cast wheels, which was the original intent with X. As we discussed earlier in the video, X had to switch to heavier forged wheels because the trains were so overweight. For X2, the lighter cast wheels also helped contribute to the overall weight savings. Ultimately, the third generation trains were so good that Fuji-Q Highland later purchased their own for Eejanaika sometime around 2014. And the trains are now equipped with the new pickle spoon support system, a pneumatic restraint release system, and the smaller road wheels used on X2. Although Fuji-Q Highland still decorates their trains with fiberglass, while Magic Mountain keeps X2's trains completely bare. Now, despite the aggressive weight reduction with the third generation trains, X2 also debuted onboard audio, which seems counterintuitive to weight savings. According to Tim Burkhart, the park originally planned to add tunnels to the ride, but ultimately abandoned that idea in favor of onboard audio, something he initially opposed because he did not want to add any weight back to the vehicles. However, the system added very little weight, and Tim was so impressed with the result that he later felt every roller coaster should feature onboard audio. X2 began testing in the spring of 2008, and compared to X's initial testing back in August of 2001, something noticeable had changed. The trains were moving more slowly through the layout. Now, this particular instance could have been because of weather, but ultimately, on average, X2's lighter vehicles would run the course at lower speeds than X's original trains. X2 officially reopened on May 24, 2008, and fans were eager to experience the ride's refined new form. The onboard audio was a hit, featuring a mix of Harry Connick Jr., Metallica, Beastie Boys, and Rage Against the Machine. X2 also introduced its now famous flamethrower effect, with twin fire cannons erupting as trains raced past into the second Raven turn. Six Flags would later replicate these enhancements in 2009, when both Superman Ride of Steel at Six Flags New England and Medusa at Six Flags Great Adventure were transformed into Bizarro. While I cannot personally say whether the new trains made the ride noticeably smoother, since myself and many others still find X2 to be fairly bouncy and jarring, the coaster's operations have been far less dramatic since the conversion, and for many reasons that's a huge win. According to Tim Burkhart, aside from X2's sheer scale, the ride is now no more difficult to maintain than a typical roller coaster. In other words, X2 finally became normal, with far more reasonable maintenance demands, downtime, and operating costs. With X2's reliability greatly improved, the next major upgrade came in its operations. Several procedural changes were introduced that allowed trains to dispatch at a far more reasonable pace. Chief among them was actually the elimination of the unload station. While the platform itself remains physically unchanged, it now serves only as a holding area. All unloading and loading now takes place in the original load station. This eliminated the need to rotate the seats twice in the unload station, saving valuable time and allowing unloading and loading to occur simultaneously, which is far better for 1 or 2 train operations. Another key change was the replacement of the floor-mounted actuators in the load station with the pneumatic system. With the floor actuators gone, so too was the possibility of them allegedly unlocking restraints during seat rotation. As a result, the redundant second restraint check was eliminated on X2, further reducing dispatch intervals. Magic Mountain initially intended to operate X2 with all 3 trains, all without the use of the unload station. Even though X2's trains are significantly lighter, the lift hill remained slow and may have even been slowed further for reasons we'll discuss shortly. This makes achieving the original theoretical of 1,680 riders per hour still impossible. In practice, it's alleged that X2 only briefly ran with 3 trains before settling into 2 train operations as the norm. While the ride's duration technically supports 3 train operation, as it takes just over 2 minutes from dispatch to reaching the final brake run, running 2 trains made sense for several reasons. For one, Magic Mountain only purchased 3 trains for X2. Combine this with the park's year-round operating schedule, This allows 2 trains to remain in service while the third undergoes its annual rebuild. The other factor was dispatch efficiency. Even with seat rotations confined to the load station, they remain relatively slow and still add noticeable time to each dispatch. The restraint system itself also isn't particularly quick for riders to secure or for attendants to verify. Personally, I think 3-train operation might still be achievable with an inspired ride crew, more staffing, and perhaps even by using the unload station again, but only during 3-train operations. But we may never know. As the ride currently stands at the time of this recording, it would be a miracle for the ride to operate with just 2 trains on the track. On the bright side, when X2 reopened, the ride crew was already dispatching trains before the previous one had even returned to the former unload station. That alone represented a massive improvement over the original X, allowing the queue to move much faster. Dispatching a train when the one on the course has slowed in the ready brakes yields a dispatch about every 130 seconds. This yields over 27 dispatches an hour, and with the ride's 28 passenger trains yields 756 riders per hour. However, I always wished that Magic Mountain incorporated the load gate setup that debuted on Eejanaika, where each side of the station has separate pens where guests can leave their loose articles, then board into the vehicles, and after the ride, then return to their pen to retrieve their items while the next group boards the attraction from a different pen. It's highly efficient and would eliminate the awkward locker setup in X2 station, but thankfully using the existing load gates from X is still efficient. That said, X2 still suffers from some operational quirks that hurt its capacity. While not the root cause of its issues, X2 continues to use the same operating panel as X. However, I think the ride would greatly benefit from updated programming to reflect the fact that the unload station is no longer used to unload riders. On most roller coasters, the ride crew only needs to enable trains to dispatch from the load station. Then the movement of all subsequent trains, such as the next train pulling into the load station, occurs automatically. In some cases, like at Six Flags Great Adventure or with certain ride manufacturers, the ride crew will also need to enable the next train to enter the load station. X2 is programmed like this, and the ride crew has to enable each train to advance from the unload to the load station, which is nothing out of the ordinary. The weird part is that the main operator must also enable trains to advance from the transfer track into the unload station. That made sense when X actively used an unload platform staffed with attendants, but it no longer does since the unload station is effectively just an extension of the brake run, and because of how the ride is programmed, this slows down its operations. When a train is rolling through the transfer track and the unload station is unoccupied, even if the main operator holds the enable button to advance the train into unload, the control system will still bring the train to a crawl at the end of the transfer track before advancing it into the unload station. The same thing also happens when advancing a train from the unload to the load station. Even with the load station unoccupied and all attendants pressing their respective advance buttons, the control system still pauses the train at the end of unload before advancing into load. On most roller coasters that require this extra enable, holding down the needed buttons in time allows the train to smoothly roll into the desired block without stopping. But this unnecessary pausing of the train twice on X2 wastes time every cycle. And the puzzling part is based on this video when the ride ran as X, trains at some point smoothly advance from the transfer track straight into the unload station. And a more recent change has slowed down the ride's operations even more. For years, the ride crew at X2 were allowed to simultaneously dispatch a train from the load station while advancing a train from the transfer track into the unload station. But now, the ride crew is only allowed to move one train at a time between the load station, the unload station, and the transfer track. This is either just a procedural change or it's now part of the ride's programming. This leads to awkward scenarios where the train in the load station is fully ready to dispatch, but the second train is sitting in the transfer block. The ride crew is then forced to choose, either dispatch the train in the station first and deal with the second train afterward, or advance the second train into the former unload station before dispatching the first. Either scenario just wastes time. On virtually any other coaster, this would not even be a decision. The train and the station would dispatch while the control system automatically advanced the following train closer to the station. I'd love to see X2 receive updated control logic that allows train movement to behave more like most roller coasters. And if the park were willing to go a step further, adding multi-move so that trains in the load station and former unload station could move simultaneously, 3-train operation might become more practical, as X2 still remains quite a popular ride to this day. Another of X2's operational quirks lies with its block system. At some point during the ride's tenure, the lift block was reprogrammed to combine it with the ready brake block, effectively reducing the coaster to 4 active block zones. While the lift hill is still physically capable of stopping a train and serving as an independent control point, it is no longer programmed to do so under normal operation. This change increases the minimum dispatch interval. Instead of allowing a train to dispatch into the lift block while another occupies the ready brakes, the next train cannot be dispatched until the train on the circuit has fully exited the ready brake block. The reasoning behind this adjustment actually stems from block check procedures. During morning startup at most roller coasters, the ride crew performs block checks to verify that the ride's control system will prevent trains from colliding with one another. On X2, this historically meant leaving one train parked in the ready brakes while sending another up the lift. As expected, the ascending train would stop just before cresting the lift hill because the block ahead remained occupied. However, X2's trains are still extraordinarily heavy compared to conventional coaster vehicles. Restarting X2's heavy trains on the lift places immense stresses on the lift chain, drive motors, and gearbox. Eliminating the block check on the lift hill reduces the frequency of these high-load restarts, thereby extending the service life of the lift chain, gearbox, and lift motors. And that precaution may be warranted. Over its lifespan, X2 has reportedly broken many lift chains, and when the ride broke its gearbox in 2006, that shut down the coaster for months. Because breaking lift chains is so common on X2, the park always has a spare lift chain in possession, which is not a common practice with most roller coasters. With the removal of the lift block from the ride's programming, X2 can dispatch a train at minimum about every 140 seconds. That equates to about 25 trains per hour, or roughly 700 riders per hour. This is not an industry-leading capacity figure, but it still represents a substantial improvement over the original X, and is likely not dramatically lower than what X2 achieved when the lift was still programmed as a standalone block. Should the ride ever return to consistent 3-train operation, this programming limitation would certainly need to be revised to reintroduce the lift hill as its own block. When it comes to X2's biggest operational challenges, the issues it faces today are still relatively minor compared to the nightmare days of X. That said, X2 certainly is not without its issues, and some of them are uniquely interesting. One such quirk is that trains can actually valley while engaging the lift hill. Despite the immense weight of both X's original trains and X2's current ones, the ride does not use feeder motors into the lift hill. Instead, the train simply coasts into the lift and engages the chain in a more traditional manner. Somehow, that engagement has always been remarkably smooth even with the weight of the trains. Something that I honestly wish Rocky Mountain Construction could replicate in their coasters today. On X2, when a train valleys on the lift approach, it's typically with an empty train in cold weather. The main operator at controls can also contribute to this. If they release the advance to lift button too early while dispatching a train, the drive tires will stop and slow the train as it exits the station, which gives the train less momentum to ride up the lift incline and catch the chain lift or anti-rollbacks. Thankfully, a valley in this location is a relatively low-stakes recovery compared to valleying in the ride's free-running section. Due to X2's exposed location and its lighter trains compared to X, cold temperatures and strong winds can severely rob momentum. During morning test runs in unfavorable conditions, trains will often crawl through the layout, barely cresting the luge turn and the second raven turn. In this clip here, it was 70 degrees Fahrenheit out with winds of 15 to 20 miles per hour, yet the ride still cycled this slowly in the morning. X2 cannot operate when winds exceed 25 miles per hour. And once that threshold is reached, the ride cannot reopen until winds drop below 10 miles per hour. By comparison, both Top Thrill Dragster at Cedar Point and King Naka at Six Flags Great Adventure, which were both coasters exceeding 400 feet in height, were permitted to operate in winds up to 35 miles per hour. And with X2 positioned in front of the park's hill, the ride is fully exposed to the wind gusts that regularly sweep through the park in that direction. As a result, X2 closes far more frequently than most of the park's other roller coasters. And like we discussed earlier in the video, because the trains are still so heavy, adding water dummies hardly makes a difference percentage-wise. So when winds are high, the only way to combat that is by closing the ride. Given the difficulty of recovering X2's massive heavy trains, the added caution makes sense. But that doesn't make it any less frustrating, especially when you travel across the country only to miss out on the park's headlining attraction. I was personally burned by this on my visit in 2022 when X2 was closed the entire day. And even on my recent visit in 2025, X2 spent a good amount of the day closed, with both instances due to high winds. If only the ride had been built on the other side of the hill where it might have been better shielded from the wind. Beyond wind-related closures, most of X2's day-to-day operational issues are fairly typical. Seats can still occasionally fail to rotate properly in the station, triggering control system faults, an issue that dates all the way back to the X era. The system can also miscount cars as the train transitions from the ready brakes into the transfer block, resulting in an automatic shutdown. The control system is also time sensitive, which is nothing unusual. After disengaging from the lift, each train is expected to complete the circuit and return to the brake run within a window of 42 to 49 seconds. If the train runs outside that range, either too fast or too slow, the ride faults and shuts down. Trains can also occasionally stop slightly out of position in the station, throwing off alignment with the air nozzle used to unlock the restraints. Staffing remains another challenge. X2 requires far more personnel than most rides in the park. Instead of just 2 attendants on the platform checking restraints, the ride needs a minimum of 4 to check restraints. Then there are 2 additional attendants called bouncers who manage guest entry into the station, with 1 on each side, while another attendant directs guests to either side of the station where the queue splits. Add in the main operator at the control panel, and X2 requires at least 8 attendants, compared to the 3 typically needed for most coasters at the park. Back when the ride operated as X and still used an unload station, 2 more attendants were required there as well, bringing the minimum staffing up to 10. When X first debuted, Magic Mountain was already struggling with staffing levels, and X only intensified the problem. Not only did it require an unusually large crew for a Six Flags park, but its extended operating hours needed to clear the massive nightly queues meant even more labor was tied up. Because X was the park's new marquee attraction, management would often pull cross-trained staff from other rides to keep X running. This left other rides understaffed, and Magic Mountain would simply close them for the day to ensure X stayed operational. Since its transformation into X2, the ride's operational history has not been without controversy. Several lawsuits have been filed over the years involving Six Flags Magic Mountain and S&S. On February 16, 2020, a 53-year-old woman reportedly sustained a traumatic brain injury while riding X2. She and her husband filed a lawsuit in November of 2021, seeking accountability from Magic Mountain and Six Flags Corporate. Reports indicated that she had a pre-existing condition of hypertension. Magic Mountain was later dismissed as a defendant in the case. In October 2010, a 52-year-old paraplegic man reportedly underwent an above-the-knee amputation following injuries he claimed were sustained on X2. He filed suit against Magic Mountain, Six Flags Corporate, and S&S. However, a jury ultimately found the defendants not negligent, and the plaintiff was awarded no damages. More recently, on June 23, 2022, A 22-year-old man allegedly suffered a brain injury while riding X2 after the train reportedly jolted to a sudden stop, violently jarring him in his seat. He was transported to the hospital and tragically passed away the following day. His parents subsequently filed a $10 million lawsuit against Magic Mountain. As of the time of this recording, it's my understanding that the final outcome of that case has not been publicly confirmed. Whether X2 was directly responsible for these incidents is difficult to determine. Millions of guests, myself included, have ridden the coaster since its opening and walked away without issue. That said, smoothness has never been X2's defining characteristic. While I am not convinced that the ride experience alone explains the incidents described, I can absolutely understand how members of the general public might find it uncomfortable, even overwhelming at times. Looking ahead, it would be awesome to see targeted smoothing improvements. If tighter manufacturing tolerances for the X-rails are achievable today, selective retracking of the ride's roughest moments, particularly the exit of the first twisting flip and the crest of the second Raven turn, can meaningfully improve ride quality. Structurally, these elements may not require replacement, but refining them for smoothness could enhance rider comfort and potentially reduce the likelihood of future complaints or legal challenges. For comparison, Dinoconda, which opened in 2012 at China Dinosaurs Park, remains the newest installation of the Fourth Dimension coaster. As the third installation of the ride model, it appears to incorporate several refinements over both X2 and Eejanaika. Most notably, Dinoconda looks to feature an upgraded suspension system between the X-rail wheel carrier and the rack gear. The dampening assembly appears capable of significantly greater travel than the systems used on X2 and Eejanaika, likely reducing rotational jerk and smoothing out seat rotations. Whether such a system could be retrofitted onto X2 is unclear, particularly since it appears to raise the lowest point of the rack gear, which could create challenges as X2 already looks to max out its rack gear at both the upper and lower limits. But if it were feasible, it would likely be a great enhancement to the ride experience. Now this raises the obvious question, can another Fourth Dimension coaster realistically be built today? The answer, at least on paper, is yes. S&S continues to list the 4D coaster as an active product on its website, meaning parks can still purchase the model. Historically, however, cost has been the largest barrier. Because of the heavy ride vehicles, these coasters require enormous amounts of steel in both the track and support structure, making them some of the most material-intensive coasters ever designed. That said, the pricing trend over time is fascinating. X reportedly cost $45 million to build in 2001. Eejanaika reportedly cost $31.6 million when it opened in 2006. Dinoconda reportedly cost $20 million in 2012, less than half the price of X before even adjusting for inflation. Now, a large portion of X's price tag can certainly be attributed to the immense research, development, delays, and modifications required to bring the prototype to life. But Dinoconda's dramatic cost reduction also reflects advancements in the ride model. Unlike X and Eejanaika, which were designed around heavier first and second generation 4D trains, Dinoconda was built from the onset to accommodate the much lighter third generation trains. As a result, Dinoconda utilizes a single continuous strongback as its track spine throughout its entire layout, rather than the dual spine configuration seen on X2 and Eejanaika. Although Dinoconda's spine is physically larger, the overall structure likely requires significantly less steel because it was never overbuilt to handle the earlier, heavier vehicles. Dinoconda was also produced domestically in China, avoiding the considerable cost of shipping the track, supports, and hardware overseas. That logistical advantage alone likely saved millions. From a layout perspective, Dinoconda is also more compact and nimble. While its height sits between its predecessors at 226 feet tall, its elements are tighter and more condensed, meaning fewer and shorter support structures are needed. It is also the shortest 4D coaster by track length at 3,445 feet, compared to X2 at 3,610 feet and Eejanaika at 3,783 feet. S&S even markets a scaled down 131 foot tall 4D coaster, which would presumably reduce material and construction cost further. However, even with these improvements, the 4D coaster remains one of the rarest ride models in the world, and perhaps for good reason. Despite cost reductions, it is still an extraordinarily expensive ride model on a per foot basis compared to most modern coasters. Maintenance demands are also higher. The trains contain far more moving components than traditional coaster vehicles. Even the lift chains are specialized and significantly heavier duty than those found on conventional coasters, thus making them more expensive since they're designed to haul the immense weight of 4D coaster trains. There is also the intensity factor. The 4D coaster is arguably the most aggressive ride model currently available on the market. For coaster enthusiasts, that's a selling point. For parks catering to a broad demographic, it's more of a risk. Many guests may find the experience overwhelming. The introduction of the 4D free spin in 2015 further complicates the equation. Parks can now purchase a similar ride with vertical seat rotation at a fraction of the cost of a true 4th dimension coaster. And as parks have looked to purchase smaller, more economical roller coasters, we've seen the installation of many 4D free spin coasters around the globe. So can a 4D coaster be built today in 2026? Absolutely. The engineering hurdles have largely been solved. The cost, while still substantial, has demonstrably decreased. What it ultimately comes down to is whether a park is willing to invest in a headline-grabbing, high-maintenance, ultra-intense attraction that might serve more as a statement piece than a ride for the masses. Now, if you ask me, it's still the most breathtaking coaster model ever created, even more so than the Intamin prefabricated wooden roller coaster, a model that I deeply admire. A next-generation 4D coaster would be top of my wish list. Eejanaika at Fuji-Q Highland is hands down my favorite roller coaster I've ever ridden. In fact, I would love to see one rise at my home park, Six Flags Great Adventure, even more so than the infamous Giga Coaster, or a coaster standing more than 300 feet tall. The park certainly has the space, and a 4D coaster would instantly become a defining, skyline-dominating centerpiece, just as X2 continues to be to this day. With all of that said, it really makes you wonder, how might history have unfolded if Six Flags Magic Mountain had agreed to build a smaller, more conservative 4th dimension coaster instead of the massive behemoth that became X? Would Aerodynamics still be in business today? What if Aero had declined the project altogether? Could they have refined the concept elsewhere, delivering a more practical prototype before scaling up? Or would financial collapse have arrived under a different project? Ultimately, building X at this scale was undeniably a mistake. As much as I love X2, which currently ranks in my personal top 10 coasters of all time, and features my favorite first drop anywhere, the ride arguably should not exist in the form it does. Six Flags pushed Aero to construct a prototype on a scale far beyond what this first of its kind concept realistically warranted, and Aero in turn accepted a level of financial and engineering risk that proved catastrophic. At the very least, Aero should have at least priced the project to better reflect the true scope of what was being attempted. And yet, despite all the turmoil, despite the bankruptcy of the company that pioneered the modern amusement ride industry, I can't help but feel grateful that X was built as it was. It remains one of the boldest, most unhinged, and most ambitious roller coasters ever constructed. After years of operational struggles and refinement, Aero's final project ultimately did achieve success. X2 stands today not as a failure, but as a testament to daring innovation. I want to extend genuine appreciation to the engineers, designers, fabricators, park staff, and maintenance teams who brought X to life, and who continue to keep it operating more than 2 decades later. As one of my favorite coasters on the planet, I sincerely hope I'll be able to ride it for many more years to come. Given its massively overbuilt track and support structure, there's reason to believe it has the longevity to do just that. I hope this video gave you a deeper understanding of X and X2, and perhaps a new appreciation for what may be the most audacious prototype coaster ever attempted. Let me know your thoughts on X and X2 in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.
X is the wildest ride on the planet.